Welcome to another OUinsider.com podcast. I'm RJ Young. I'm joined by OUI staff writer Colin Kennedy. Colin, what's going on, man?
Oh, great day. I mean, we're going to talk some ball as we record this. It's opening day in Major League Baseball that ran that area for the Texas Rangers. So naturally, I'm very excited to get to the weekend and watch some baseball. But football's on the mind of everyone for good reason. So I'm excited to get all into the topics regarding OU football and recruiting.
Right on, man. So let's start with what the people really want, which is this recruiting news, especially as it pertains to defensive backs and defensive tackles and, all this moving and shaking. So Isaiah Johnson drops a top 5 yesterday as we are recording this. And in that top 5 is Oklahoma, LSU, USC, Georgia, and Arizona State. But he made a point of pointing out that Oklahoma has been in on him from the very beginning since he started playing ball back in West Virginia. 6'2"-ish, about $180, legit 4.5 speed. He feels like he fits into what Grinch would want.
Yeah, and I mean, Roy Manning has consistently touched base with this guy throughout the process. And as you mentioned, the kid was out in Bluefield, West Virginia. And from that time on, since he's quote-unquote in Big 12 country, the Sooners have had their eyes on him. Yeah, I know. I hate to say that, but, I mean, I have to, I guess. But now that he's transferred, he's in Playa del Rey, California. And even though that's not necessarily in that quote-unquote Big 12 country, of course, we know Oklahoma's past in recruiting California talent. So Isaiah Johnson making that move doesn't necessarily change anything from an Oklahoma perspective in terms of their recruitment of him. But it's been kind of interesting to follow because you mentioned it, Arizona State's in that top group, and it seems like the Sun Devils are now the favorite in this recruitment. And I personally am fascinated by this because I don't think we're talking enough about how great of a job Herm Edwards, Antonio Pierce, and that Arizona State staff has done. These now 2 recruiting classes or more. I mean, last year's group that they put together was very, very good in my eyes. And right now, I mean, it seems like they're the leader for Isaiah Johnson with Steve Wiltfong putting in a crystal ball fairly recently in favor of the Sun Devils. So Oklahoma's definitely in the running here. It sounds like Roy Manning has done a very good job of recruiting Isaiah Johnson. But at the same time, I mean, the move makes you wonder what might the outcome look like in the end. And it seems like that West Coast favorite is now Arizona State. So Oklahoma will have to find a way to challenge the Sun Devils moving forward.
Yeah, in learning about Isaiah Johnson, one of the things that I figured out most was Mom has a lot to say about what's going on. And one of the things that is on the agenda is he apparently has moved around a few times, and he would like to not necessarily do that again, which, Georgia's way across the country, right? LSU is further away than Oklahoma. Oklahoma obviously is in the middle of the country. And Arizona State's just kind of, over there. But it's still far enough away that might have to pick up and move. Now, that said, what you just said is so terribly important. Antonio Pierce and Herm Edwards in particular have been doing an outstanding job, and we should add there Jamar Cain comes from that staff, and you've seen what kind of an animal he has been on the recruiting trail since taking the job in February at Oklahoma. So I'm not necessarily surprised, but between Arizona State and Dante Williams out at USC, my goodness, like those two programs, since basically we saw Clay Helton overhaul the defensive staff, we've seen Herm Edwards continue to rely on the expertise of Antonio Pierce while saying, hey, Marvin Lewis, all you got to do is coach. You don't really have to recruit like that. If we introduce you to a kid, fine. But Antonio's got all of that. And, yeah, you pointed it out. We should talk more about what the Sun Devils are doing, but I tend to look at them from the vantage point of Jaden Daniels. And once he decided to go there, and then he got the job, and then he put together the kind of season that he did with an enormous win over Oregon, yeah, Arizona State feels like a dark horse to not just win the Pac-12 championship, but to win the college football playoff spot that I believe would go to a Pac-12 team for the first time in years, even with the conference-only slate. Because, I mean, I get into this, but, I think USC, Oregon, Arizona State are actually better off not playing non-conference games this year as it pertains to their resume and getting into the playoff.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think Oregon is definitely the favorite for me in that conference, even though there are questions at quarterback. But, I mean, when you look towards the future, I think this relates to Oklahoma specifically because as we go forward and you see a lot of these programs on the rise, you start to wonder, okay, who's going to be that challenger against Oklahoma to kind of take that third or fourth spot? Because you would just naturally assume, based on what we've seen, that an SEC team is going to be towards the top and maybe like a Clemson because of the dominance that's been shown in the ACC. And so when you look at the Pac-12, I think Oklahoma really has to take a look at what teams like Oregon or, of course, Arizona State are doing right now on the recruiting trail because, I mean, Arizona State just got Tommy Hill, and I know OU is pretty high on that guy. And, I mean, they go get Junior Alexander, Jaden Williams out of South Oak Cliff. There's some pretty solid names in the class already, and there are a lot of guys on their board still left. I mean, the Sun Devils surged last cycle towards the end. I remember they got, 2 or 3 guys committed to them, the All-American Bowl in San Antonio. They have some really talented players coming into that program. And while I think Oregon's probably the more sustainable bet moving forward, Arizona State's going to be another name that has a lot of college football playoff committee members taking an eye at them. And maybe down the line, if Oklahoma slips up once or twice somewhere in the future, we could be looking at Herm Edwards in Arizona State or Oregon, obviously, taking that spot from the Sooners.
I think I'm penciling in USC versus Oregon in the Pac-12 championship, even as I like Arizona State, because that USC offense has an opportunity to be just nasty. Like, I need to write this out, but you could start Tyler Vaughns, you could start Brew McCoy, you could start Kyle Ford, and you could start, not Michael Pittman Jr., he's gone. Amon-Ra St. Brown. Oh, man. All across the board in an air raid. Good night, right?
On Slovis.
Right? Well, I mean, and now that we know that he can do the job, like, I would love to see Oregon's defense versus Arizona State, USC's offense. Like, that's the reason I want to see that game played. Is USC's defense could feature Kayvon Thibodeau, who was number 1 player in the 2019 class and showed it with like 9.5 sacks as a true freshman. Noah Sewell, who they still have listed at inside linebacker, 270 pounds. All right. Baby man, Justin Flo at middle. And then they return a whole bunch of dudes that absolutely take lids off. So, like, I really want to see them play each other selfishly.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they obviously have a bunch of defensive backs returning, and then they go get Dante Manning, who at one point seemed like a heavy OU lean. And I think Dante Manning
he was committed. He was committed.
Yeah, I mean, he was obviously committed and then a lean, and
right.
They still got him. And so I'm telling you, man, like the Pac-12, we dog on them a lot. I know I'm guilty of that personally.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Arizona State, Oregon, USC, we're talking about a very viable conference that's on the rise that could potentially challenge Oklahoma or whatever Big 12 representative is trying to take a college football playoff spot.
Oh, man. So let's go from him to Damon Harmon, who we've seen some crystal balls come in here a little bit for Oklahoma, which would be good news as OU is still searching for another cornerback to join this class, especially with the news of Wilt Fong kind of coming in there, letting everybody know what Arizona State has done on the recruiting trail with Isaiah Johnson. So what's your read on Damon Harmon and what he's thinking?
Yeah, I actually made a couple of calls with some DB trainers out on the East Coast, and I'm probably on the verge of putting in a crystal ball myself. It just seems like Oklahoma's done a great job of recruiting Damon Harmon, and obviously him being a teammate of Kelvin Gilliam, I would assume definitely plays a factor into this thing. But, I mean, you look at him, he's a really talented player. I mean, our board was very impressed with his ball hawk skills. I think he has some ideal size. When we look at 6'1", 178, probably he'll get up to 185, 190 pounds in college. You never really know the weight-wise. I mean, if you're 6'1" and above, I have to assume that Roy Manning's going to be able to do something with you. So I would personally lean Oklahoma heavily right now. I'm probably going to put in my crystal ball after this thing and do a quick write-up. But, I mean, for all of our podcast listeners, I would be very excited about Damon Harmon because not only is he a very good cornerback, like you mentioned, they want another guy in this class at that position. He also helps with Kelvin Gilliam, who Steve Wiltfong put a crystal ball in for Penn State, which probably caught a lot of people off guard.
Yeah.
I'm still reading into that situation. I still kind of like where OU stands, but I'm, again, at the top surface of my research. And then to kind of further it, I mean, Damon Harmon has a lot of great ties with defensive backs out there on the East Coast. I mean, you saw him hanging out with Grimes just a couple of days ago. And also, Oklahoma's pretty heavily recruiting a guy like Damon David for the safety position, who I think as I mentioned on this podcast, an absolute baller. So you'd have to assume getting a guy like Harmon would help in the recruitment of a guy like David. So in the end, if Oklahoma pulls this off, and it looks like they're on the verge of making a really strong move for Damon Harmon, it would be extremely beneficial in several ways.
I feel like I bring this point up, and I'm just going to bring it up briefly, but it's another kiddo that is ranked outside the top 500, right? That's going to follow Caleb Johnson, who is also ranked outside the top 500. And Oklahoma beating out the likes of Group of 5 competition for a kid is what you expect. Beating out LSU, Ohio State, Georgia is where it should be. And while Grinch apparently has a prototype that he likes, man, the separation at the college football playoff is stark. And it's not about winning the Big 12 anymore. It's about winning a semifinal, because now we're getting laughed at for picking Oklahoma in any of these games, right? And to be fair, I haven't, right? I got maligned on the board for picking Alabama in the Orange Bowl. And I'm like, no, I watched the defense for a year. That doesn't change when they get to face Tua Tagovailoa and Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs. It doesn't change, right? It gets worse, among other things. So in talking about those things, right, we're talking about Latrell McCutcheon being the biggest win so far on the defensive side of the ball, not named Ethan Downs. Last guy we have to check in on is another Oklahoma high school product. That'd be Kendall Daniels, who has been compared to Isaiah Simmons, who can play both linebacker positions in a 4-2-5, can play both safety positions in most conventional defenses, can play your nickel slot, can be a 4'9" rush guy, and at 6'4" and pushing 225 pounds. I've said it would be a tremendous boon for Oklahoma to be able to keep him in state, and he's kind of kid that you have to win. And yet, it feels like Oklahoma's going to lose another top safety for the third time in a row to another program outside of the Big 12.
Yeah, man, it's absolutely devastating. Obviously, Texas A&M taking the heavy crystal ball favorite fairly recently. I mean, I wrote about it not too long ago. Kendall Daniels is a must-land prospect for Oklahoma. I mean, obviously, you can go back and you can talk about Proctor or Dax Hill, some of the big-name safeties that have left the state to go to other big-name programs. But in my opinion, I mean, when you talk about Kendall Daniels and you talk about his fit in Speed D and Alex Grinch's system, you mentioned, I mean, the guy is 6'4". He can play almost every single position in the center of your defense. The guy fits exactly what you want to do if you're Oklahoma's coaches trying to revamp this defense. And I would argue that losing him is probably one of, if not the biggest loss of the three, because not only is he an extremely talented player, but he fitted exactly what Oklahoma wants to do. Now, Texas A&M did some pretty strong surging very recently. I mean, it wasn't too long ago. I had people around the Beg area telling me, like, oh, he'll go to Oklahoma, and if it's not Oklahoma, it would probably be like Clemson. And I was led to believe that was the situation. But now it looks like the Aggies are the strong favorite. And I'm not going to touch the crystal ball there. RJ, this recruitment has just been a whirlwind, and I try and stay out of those situations. But, I mean, Kendall Daniels, if he ends up picking Texas A&M on that announcement date of August 1st, it's a massive loss for several reasons for Oklahoma, and it's one that I'm sure fans will dwindle on for a very long time to come.
Mm-hmm.